Chapter 22, the Progressive Era. This chapter discusses the period from about 1900 to 1916, a time of general prosperity, but also a time when industrial workers, tenant farmers, immigrants, and racial minorities fought poverty and prejudice. The changing face of industrialism. As industry grew larger, it provided more goods at lower prices. Despite a residue of social problems left by the old century, the new century began on a note of optimism. The innovative Model T. Henry Ford began mass-producing autos, thereby transforming the industry. He made a small profit on each unit, but sold cars in such numbers that his gross profits were enormous. He introduced the Model T, his greatest success, in 1908, at a time when the federal government began to subsidize highways. The burgeoning trusts. The trend towards bigness in industry accelerated after 1900 in such fields as oil, rubber, and railroads. Bankers like J.P. Morgan provided integrated control through interlocked directorates. The trusts were never very popular and were denounced as threats to equal opportunity, but some defended them on the grounds that they led to greater efficiency. Managing the machines. In the larger industries, managers became more interested in the manufacturing process than in the welfare or morale of the workers. Efficiency became the ultimate goal. Frederick Taylor was its philosopher and the assembly line its symbol. Workers benefited by better paychecks, but mass production increased the danger and the tedium of long workdays. In 1911, Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire demonstrated the increased risk of factory work. Society's masses. In order to increase production, employment had to expand rapidly. As a result, women, immigrants, blacks, and Mexican Americans entered the labor force in large numbers. Though they did more of the work, they enjoyed a smaller share of the rewards. Better times on the farm. Farmers generally prospered in the period. Eastern farmers gained greater access to international markets, and Western farmers benefited from vast irrigation projects. The increasing prosperity, however, was unequally shared. Tenant farmers, many of them African Americans, still endured poverty and ill health. Women and children at work. Women continued to enter the workforce in increasing numbers despite complaints that they should stay at home. Women formed their own unions and lobbied for their own interests and those of the children who held jobs. In 1921, Congress finally passed laws protecting the health of pregnant workers and their infants. The Niagara Movement and the NAACP. Black workers, male and female, faced exceptional hardships. Forced to work for low wages, excluded from most labor unions, and brutalized by aggressive racism, they had to rely on themselves to improve conditions. In 1905, W.E.B. Du Bois and others rejected the argument of Booker T. Washington that African Americans must work within a racist society. The Niagara Movement demanded immediate respect and equal rights of all Americans. This demand was generally ignored, and despite efforts by organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League, African American workers received the fewest benefits from the nation's growing prosperity. I hear the whistle. Immigrants in the labor force. Europeans, Mexicans, and Asians immigrated to the United States in large numbers between 1901 and 1920, forming a distinct part of the working force. Since many of the immigrants could not speak English, they were considered a social problem. Various programs were introduced to Americanize them, but hostility to their mere presence led Congress to limit immigration from China, Japan, Mexico, and Southern and Central Europe. Conflicts in the workplace. Labor unrest became so bitter between 1915 and 1918 that industrial productivity actually fell and union membership soared. Organizing labor. The American Federation of Labor remained the largest union, but its failure to include unskilled labor, women, and African Americans led to the formation of the Women's Trade Union League in 1903 and the Industrial Workers of the World in 1905. These more radical organizations lacked large numbers, but won a number of spectacular strikes. Fear of class warfare increased. Working with workers. To avoid problems, many employers began to improve working conditions to avoid trouble. Henry Ford, for example, doubled wages and reduced the workday, thereby increasing production and ending union activity in his plants. Mills in Manchester, New Hampshire, are a good example of the benevolent, paternalistic approach to managing the workforce. The companies operated efficiently and profitably by hiring whole families to whom it provided playgrounds, health care, and other benefits. A new urban culture. Mass production meant mass consumption and a more abundant life for most Americans. For the first time in their history, ordinary people had free time on their hands and used it to enjoy themselves. Spectator sports, especially baseball, became immensely popular, as did movies, phonograph records, and light reading. Production and consumption. Between 1900 and 1920, American manufacturers, especially in the textiles, became more efficient about creating a demand for their products through advertising and more efficient about supplying the demand that they created by mass production. The American people enjoyed a flood of goods that raised their standard of living dramatically. At the same time, wealth was being increasingly concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. Living and dying in an urban nation. By 1920, less than one-third of American people still lived in rural areas. Cities were growing at a colossal rate and began to take on modern form. They were still dangerous, unhealthy places to live, but they were beginning to be improved. Los Angeles, for example, adopted zoning regulations to separate industrial, commercial, and residential areas. Popular pastimes. Americans flocked to baseball and football games, movies and concerts, and made heroes of athletes and band leaders like John Philip Sousa. Ragtime and the foxtrot caught on. The blues and jazz became the music of all Americans, and vaudeville reached its peak. Science fiction novels like the Tom Swift series familiarized Americans with spaceships and ray guns. Experimentation in the arts. Serious artists began to change old art forms. Isadora Duncan experimented with new forms of dance, while writers like Eliot and Pound introduced new forms of poetry. In painting, the Ashcan school of post-impressionism challenged older ideas of what art was. The Progressive Era did not eradicate racism, nor did it end labor conflicts, but there were solid social and economic gains, and there was a sense of excitement that social experiments could work. The first 2 decades of the 20th century were a time of sweeping change that affected American society, culture, politics, and the economy. Progressive reform reshaped the landscape of the country, restructured taxes, regulated businesses, changed the political system, and altered the life of Americans, especially the working and middle classes, in an attempt to make a difference and fulfill the promise of a nation.